They went outside the military headquarters in Tel Aviv and were yelling, as you could hear in the beginning of this broadcast, Achshav, which means now, bring them back now.
Now, let's head over to Tel Aviv. That is the sound of thousands of protesters who turned out in the streets last night after the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, killed 3 Israeli hostages after mistaking them for terrorists. Let's welcome back to the show Jotam Confino, foreign editor at Jewish News, who is in Tel Aviv. Jotam, tell us a little bit more about the protests last night.
Yeah, well, they erupted quite sporadically after the announcement of the killing of the 3 hostages. Obviously, the families of the hostages who are still in Gaza are absolutely furious, not with the soldiers who killed the hostages, because they know that obviously they didn't do it on purpose, but they are furious with the government for failing to bring back the remaining hostages after 70 days of war. So they went outside the military headquarters in Tel Aviv and were yelling, as you could hear in the beginning of this broadcast, Achshav, which means now, bring them back now. And tonight, the war cabinet is set to meet to discuss renewed efforts to basically relaunch negotiations with Hamas. The chief of the Mossad intelligence agency met with Qatar's prime minister yesterday, and he's expected to meet him again today in Europe to talk about a renewed hostage ceasefire negotiation.
Jotam, has there been any criticism at all for the fact that the details coming out on the shooting of these 3 hostages was that they were waving a white flag? I mean, it is against the rules of engagements to shoot at people who are waving a white flag.
No, absolutely. They clearly violated the army's rules of engagement, and the IDF also said that in a briefing to journalists earlier. So that's clear. What is not entirely clear is how they could mistake them for Hamas terrorists when they were clearly shirtless, waving a white flag, and in one instance they were even yelling in Hebrew. But in the soldiers' defense, the area where they're fighting right now is incredibly difficult. It's urban warfare like you haven't seen anywhere else in the world, basically. Hamas are laying traps for Israeli soldiers all the time. They're ambushing them. Just last week they killed 9 Israeli soldiers in an ambush attack. And also they are apparently, according to the army, they're using dummies, dummies of children to lure Israeli soldiers close to them. They're trying to basically lure them into any sort of trap. And one last thing, Hamas is fighting in civilian clothes. Well, that means that it's incredibly difficult to know who's who. But this clearly was a huge mistake. There's no doubt about that.
We've been talking, of course, in the past few weeks, you and I, Jotam, and every week we talk about the protests which are focused within Israel about bringing the hostages back. What are the people wanting their government to do? Is it go and get them back? Is it negotiate with Hamas? Are the Israeli people prepared for their government to negotiate with Hamas for the return of hostages, or do they not want to have Hamas at the table and want those hostages being brought back via a military engagement?
I think in the beginning they wanted the army to go in and get them, but it became pretty clear that task is almost impossible. We've seen one successful attempt to get 1 hostage back. Other than that, we've seen failed attempts, which led to the killing of 1. And I would say it's almost impossible. And I think it's becoming incredibly clear now, especially after what we saw yesterday with killing of hostages that actually escaped from Hamas captivity. So what we're hearing now is very specific calls from the families, but also from other Israelis, to just basically give Hamas whatever they want. They don't care anymore. 70 days is 70 days too long.
Finally, Jotam, what is the atmosphere within Israel and within the people in Israel when you hear a lot more criticism come towards the Israeli government, towards the IDF, a lot of governments raising the issue that actually, too many Palestinian lives have been collateral damage. Everyone's still supporting Israel and its right to defend itself, but people are starting to question the amount of collateral damage, which is a terrible way of putting it, but the amount of innocent lives that are being lost in Gaza. What is the mood in Israel? Are people aware that perhaps the support is not as strong as it was in week one from certain areas of the Western world, if you like?
They are, but they're asking two questions to those people who criticize them. Number one, what is your solution? Ceasefire, and then what? Do you want Hamas to stay in power in Gaza? That's number one. And number two, they also call hypocrisy. After 9/11, an alliance of countries invaded and occupied two countries for 20 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people. So they are absolutely not understanding of the international community and how it can call for ceasefire without coming with any sort of solution.
And just finally, we heard from the UK ambassador here, the Israeli ambassador, that the idea of a two-state solution is no longer something that can be supported. Does that marry up with the feeling of the people of Israel? Because sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish what the feeling of the Israeli people is and what the Israeli government are saying.
I suspect that this feeling will change a year from now. Right now, Israel is at war. It is the last thing it's thinking about is giving the Palestinians a state. But eventually, when everything is calmed down, I'm sure that we'll go back to having at least half the population advocating for some sort of a two-state solution.
As ever, it's fascinating always to speak to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Jotam Confino there, foreign editor at Jewish News, who is speaking to me live from Tel Aviv.